The trembling hands didn't belong to someone afraid. They belonged to someone remembering. Laura Bennett restocked the medication cart on the third floor of Sacred Heart, her fingers moving through the precise choreography she'd repeated 10,000 times, ampules of epinephrine, syringes with 25-gauge needles, for tubing color-coded for speed. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical monotone above her head. The antiseptic smell of the corridor, that particular blend of bleach and something chemical she'd never quite identified, masked the phantom odor of cordite that still visited her some mornings, uninvited, a sensory ghost from a life she'd buried so deep that even her own sister thought she'd been working coastal hospitals for 5 years. The slight tremor in her hands wasn't weakness. It was muscle memory fighting against disguise. Somewhere beneath the nurse's badge and the careful civilian voice was a senior chief petty officer who could field dress a sucking chest wound in 14 seconds without looking down, whose hands had held 3 men conscious through a firefight in Tikrit under mortar fire that turned the sky orange. Those hands had carried Colonel Reeve across 60 meters of open ground while rounds kicked up pavement around them. Those hands had kept him breathing until the medevac landed. But that was a different person. That person didn't exist anymore. Laura finished the cart and wheeled it toward the cardiac wing, her gait controlled and even. The limp was barely noticeable now, just the faintest hesitation in her left leg where shrapnel had embedded 3 years ago during the same operation that had cost her everything. She'd learned to walk through pain the way civilians learn to walk through rain. Pain was information. Pain was data. Nothing more. Sacred Heart's night shift was perfect for someone trying to disappear into institutional machinery. The corridors were quieter. The lighting was forgiving. The staff didn't ask questions. She'd been here for 8 months and no one had learned anything real about her. They knew her as quiet. Competent. The nurse who never complained and always stayed late. The nurse who moved through the hospital like someone trying not to be noticed, whose voice never rose above a certain register, whose eyes never quite met theirs directly. The locker in the break room held her secret. Buried at the bottom, wrapped in plastic beneath spare scrubs, was a pair of combat boots. They were worn. The leather had creased in places that told a story about 1,000 patrols through Helmand Province and Loga Valley. The laces were frayed. The soles were cracked. They were the most valuable thing she owned because they were the only physical proof that the life she'd lived before this one had actually happened. She touched them sometimes before her shift, one measured breath, acknowledging that version of herself the way a widow might touch a wedding ring. Dr. Sterling arrived for rounds at 11:33 p.m. Laura knew the exact time because she'd been watching the clock, not consciously but the way a trained observer watches anything, automatically, without effort, the way a sniper notes wind direction before being asked. He moved through the corridor with the confidence of someone accustomed to occupying space that should have belonged to him, his silk tie a precise Windsor knot, his smile practiced in front of mirrors but never reaching his eyes. The hospital had paid him $640,000 last year. Laura had seen the public salary records. She'd also seen the phantom billing codes he'd been running through the cardiac unit for the past 14 months. She didn't know yet that he'd seen her trembling hands on the medication cart and recognized them as a threat. Sterling stopped at the medication station where she was preparing 4 lines. His presence made the air pressure change, the way it did when atmospheric conditions shifted before a storm. He was studying her with the calculating attention of someone taking inventory, not of her professional competence but of her as an asset to be evaluated or eliminated. "How are you holding up?" His voice carried the rehearsed concern of a man who'd taken a customer service workshop once and decided he'd mastered human interaction. "The night shift can be stressful. I've noticed you sometimes look tense." Laura didn't look up from the 4 she was preparing. She'd learned that maintaining eye contact during these interactions gave men like Sterling more information than they deserved. Her voice came out quiet, modulated, the voice of someone who'd learned to make herself smaller. "I'm doing well, Doctor. Thank you for asking. You worked the cardiac unit last night too, didn't you? That's a lot of overtime." Now she did raise her eyes. Just a glance. Measured. Respectful. Deferential. Everything a woman in her position was supposed to be. I pick up extra shifts when I can, sir. He smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile someone gives when they've identified a weakness in someone else's position and decided how to exploit it. He nodded slowly and moved past her down the corridor, his shoes making quiet clicking sounds against the tile floor, a sound that reminded her of something she'd heard in a different life, boots on concrete, commanders walking past troops they'd already decided were expendable. She realized her hands had started trembling again. Laura finished the 4 lines and stayed another 2 hours past the end of her shift, which she did for nights a week, moving through the hospital corridors with the quiet efficiency of someone for whom invisibility was a survival strategy. She checked on 3 patients in rooms 314, 316, and 319. She helped a night shift intern locate a blood pressure cuff that someone had left in the wrong supply cabinet. She made coffee in the break room that no one would drink but that she'd offer anyway, the ritual of it a way of being useful without demanding acknowledgement. At 5:33 a.m., as she was changing out of her scrubs, the fire alarm didn't sound. The overhead page didn't activate. The hospital continued its quiet nighttime rhythm, the way it always did in those hours before dawn when the administrative staff hadn't yet arrived and the place belonged to nurses and patients and the occasional emergency department doctor between cases. Her phone didn't ring. She didn't know it yet, but emergency services were already moving. 300 miles away, at Kingsley Field near Klamath Falls, AC the 130 Hercules was being rolled out of a hangar. Flight crew was being briefed. A medevac helicopter from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the unit known as the Night Stalkers, was being prepped for immediate launch with a flight time to Portland of 47 minutes. Colonel Reeve had suffered acute myocardial infarction while conducting a classified briefing. His heart had stopped. Paramedics had restored rhythm, but his condition was deteriorating. Sacred Heart had the closest cardiac facility capable of handling the level of care required. He was coming to Portland. To Sacred Heart. To the same hospital where Laura Bennett had spent the past 8 months pretending to be someone small. She was in her car, driving through the pre-dawn darkness, when the call came through on the hospital line. An unfamiliar voice, military precise, asking for the nursing supervisor on duty. "We have an incoming emergency airlift. Colonel Reeve, United States Air Force, critical cardiac condition, ETA 6:22 a.m. We need your best people on this one." The nurses heard about it during shift change. Laura heard about it the way she heard most things, by listening to conversations not directed at her while pretending to focus on other work. She was stocking the code cart when someone mentioned the name. Reeve. Air Force Colonel. Incoming critical patient. The medication bottle she was holding slipped. It didn't fall. Her hand caught it with the kind of reflexive precision that civilian nurses didn't possess, the kind of speed that came from muscle memory and training, the kind that made her aware in that instant that she needed to be more careful about letting people see what she was actually capable of. Because she knew that name. She knew it the way you know your own reflection. She knew it from 3 years ago in Tikrit, where she'd been something other than what she was pretending to be now. She knew it from carrying him across 60 meters of open ground with rounds impacting all around them. She knew it from the moment he'd looked back at her with gratitude and something like recognition before the medevac took him and she'd disappeared back into the chaos of the operation. She knew his name because she'd spent 3 years trying to forget it. By 6:15 a.m. the emergency department was organized controlled chaos. 3 teams were in place. Monitors had been set up. The surgical suite was on alert. Laura moved through the corridors with the rest of the staff, maintaining her careful invisibility, telling herself that she would simply do what anyone would do, show up, do her job, remain unnoticed, and then go home to the apartment where she'd live the rest of her quiet life, alone with her combat boots and the person she used to be. At 6:22 a.m., the helicopter appeared over Portland through the pre-dawn fog, its rotors thrashing the air into submission, its presence turning the morning from peaceful to urgent in the space of a single heartbeat. The sound was enormous. It was the sound of a life crashing back into another life. It was the sound of consequence arriving at velocity. The medevac team brought him in on a stretcher strapped down, tubes already in place, his chest bare for the emergency defibrillator pads, his face grey with the pallor of someone whose body had stopped believing in survival. Laura watched from her position in the hallway as they moved him past, as the doctors started calling out vital signs and orders in that clipped, efficient language of crisis management. And then she saw his forearm. There, just visible above the defibrillator pad, was a tattoo. She'd never seen it before, she'd never gotten close enough to him in Tikrit, there had been no time for anything except movement and survival and getting him to the helicopter. But the letters were unmistakable. Elaborate script. Military callsign style. The name written on his skin in permanent ink. Laura. He'd written her name on his body the way warriors write the names of the people who saved them, permanent testimony to a moment when someone chose to carry him across open ground under fire instead of leaving him to bleed out alone. She stood in the hallway as they passed, her hands at her sides, her face a mask of professional composure, her heart doing something in her chest that felt like returning to a place she'd spent 3 years trying to escape. The doors to the critical care unit swung shut. And that's when the real nightmare began. Dr. Sterling's voice carried through the critical care unit like a surgeon's blade, precise, cutting, designed to wound. Laura stood at the medication cart outside Colonel Reeve's room when Sterling emerged, his expression arranged with the kind of practiced concern that didn't reach his eyes. He walked past her, then stopped. Turned. Called her name loud enough that the Colonel's family inside the room could hear every word. Nurse Bennett. A moment. The way he said it made the air pressure change. 2 nurses at the opposite end of the hallway pretended not to notice. Laura set down the cardiac glycoside she'd been verifying and followed Sterling into the Colonel's room, where Mrs. Reeve sat rigid in a vinyl chair and a 12-year-old girl with dark eyes watched from the foot of the bed. The Colonel remained unconscious, his chest rising and falling in rhythm with the ventilator, unaware that the woman who'd carried him through Tikrit was about to be dismantled in front of his family. Sterling held up the medication administration record, his finger tapping the dosage notation with theatrical precision. I've reviewed Colonel Reeve's cardiac regimen, and I've found a significant discrepancy. He paused, a deliberate silence that made Mrs. Reeve lean forward. Nurse Bennett administered a dosage of digoxin that exceeded safe parameters for his renal function. His voice descended into something almost intimate, as if sharing a confidence. Her negligence could have triggered a fatal arrhythmia. Laura's hands remained perfectly still. She stepped forward and pointed to the lab results clipped to the chart. His creatinine is 0.9. His GFR is 82. The dosage of 250 micrograms was appropriate for his weight and renal clearance. Her voice didn't waver. Didn't plead. Didn't ask permission to defend herself. Just stated facts like a soldier reporting coordinates. Sterling smiled. That was the worst part, the smile. Are you questioning my clinical judgment, night shift? The nickname had been floating through the unit for weeks now, shorthand for someone fit only for shifts no one watched, for care no one supervised. For work that didn't really matter. Mrs. Reeve's face went pale. The girl's eyes filled with tears, confusion written across her features as she looked between her father's unconscious form and the woman Sterling had just publicly accused of endangering him. Laura maintained eye contact with Sterling. One tear escaped down her cheek, not from fear, not from humiliation, but from something older, something that came from 18 years of swallowing these moments. She wiped it without breaking his gaze, her hand steady as a surgical laser. I've survived worse men than you, Doctor. The words hung in the ventilator's rhythm. Sterling's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected her to speak at all, much less to speak like that, with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst the world could offer. The Colonel's wife reached for her daughter's hand. Laura turned and left the room, her posture unchanged, her breathing even, the mask still perfectly in place. But Sterling wasn't finished. He never was. The next morning, a fabricated disciplinary write-up appeared on the unit board in the main corridor, the kind of notice every staff member would see during their shift. The typeface was official, the letterhead pristine. It read, Bennett, L, Medication Administration Error, failure to verify renal function, final warning. The date was backdated to 3 days ago, a phantom violation documented and filed, now part of her permanent record for anyone willing to read it. 8 nurses worked the day shift. By 1100 hours, when Laura entered the break room carrying her lunch tray, every single one of them found urgent business elsewhere. Chairs scraped against linoleum. Nobody met her eyes. A nurse named Patricia, who'd covered Laura's shifts twice and asked for her advice on a pediatric case, suddenly remembered a phone call she needed to make. Another, Marcus, stared at his coffee as if it contained the answer to whether he should stay. Within 90 seconds, the break room was empty except for the hum of the vending machine and the fluorescent lights overhead, their ballast creating a sound like distant electrical fire. Laura ate alone. Her sandwich tasted like antiseptic. She watched the clock tick forward and realized that silence from colleagues was worse than Sterling's words had ever been. It meant they believed him, or they didn't care enough to question it, or worse, they were afraid. Afraid of standing beside someone marked. That evening, Laura drove north through Portland rain, past the Veterans Affairs Clinic where she'd worked under her real credentials, past the neighborhoods where she'd tried to build a civilian life. She parked in the VA hospital lot and walked through the automatic doors not as a provider but as a patient. The waiting room held 13 veterans in various states of worn-down exhaustion, fatigues with unit patches, service-connected disabilities visible in the way they favored one leg or another, the 1,000-yard stare of men and women who'd learned to survive on less than hope. She filled out an intake form with handwriting that didn't match the name she'd given. Medical history, anxiety, sleep disorder, unspecified trauma. Chief complaint, follow-up evaluation. She sat between an older gentleman with a prosthetic arm and a woman probably her age with scars on both hands. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out the boots. They were weathered tan leather, laced with paracord instead of the original laces, the soles worn through in places where weight distributed unevenly. The tread on the right heel was smooth from a limp she'd learned to hide. She'd kept them hidden in her locker for 8 years, folded in a garbage bag at the bottom beneath spare scrubs and the charge cables for equipment that no longer worked. No one at Sacred Heart knew she had them. No one in Portland knew they existed. She held them in her lap and stared at the coordinates stitched inside the right boot in faded thread, 33.3371, 43.3915. Tikrit. The exact grid where she'd gone into the street with a senior chief's authority and a battlefield nurse's hands to retrieve the man who now lay unconscious in Sterling's care, his body a potential witness to something Sterling needed buried, along with the woman who'd saved him in the first place. Laura realized then, sitting among veterans in the VA waiting room, holding the only physical proof that she'd ever been anyone at all, that disappearing had a cost. You could hide your military record. You could change your name. You could wear civilian scrubs and keep your voice deferential and absorb every insult with one measured breath. You could make yourself invisible so thoroughly that no one ever looked long enough to find the person underneath. But when you'd been erased well enough, you had nothing left to prove you existed. The rain outside hammered against the windows like applause for a performance only she knew she'd given. A clerk called a name, not hers, and a veteran stood slowly, favoring the left side, and walked toward the medical bay. Laura tucked the boots back into her bag and sat in the silence, realizing that rock bottom wasn't a place you fell to. It was the moment you realized you were already standing there. The alarm didn't scream. It wailed like something alive and wounded, and Laura heard it from the supply closet where she was restocking 18-gauge needles at 2:07 a.m. Code Blue. ICU wing. That was all the announcement said, but her body already knew. The way her shoulders tensed. The way her hands stopped moving. The way the plastic box of needles suddenly felt impossibly heavy. She'd walked back into Sacred Heart at 6:45 p.m. the previous evening because rent was due on the 15th and disappearing into the VA waiting room wasn't survival, it was just enduring the same way she'd endured Tikrit, which was to say she wasn't enduring it at all, she was just waiting for permission to stop. The night shift supervisor, Michelle, had looked at her with eyes that held both apology and fear, the kind of look people gave when they'd already chosen a side and it wasn't yours. We have you down for med-surg tonight. Not ICU. Not ICU. which was Sterling's doing. The restriction had come through hospital policy just before shift change. Laura's name flagged for supervised patient contact only pending a peer review process. Nobody said it was because Sterling had fabricated evidence of incompetence. Nobody had to. The message was written in the way Michelle wouldn't quite meet her eyes, in the disciplinary notice still hanging on the unit board like a scarlet letter printed in Courier New. Laura had nodded without speaking. She'd learned that silence was cheaper than argument, and she had 4 years until her VA disability pension kicked in, which meant for years of nursing shifts and rent and pretending that the combat boots hidden in her locker were just old footwear instead of proof that she'd once been someone who mattered. But then the Colonel's condition had started moving like a storm system across the monitors. She wasn't supposed to be watching the monitors, med-surg patients, supervised contact only, but the ICU wing was visible through the glass partition, and between 8:08 p.m. and 1:15 a.m., she'd watched the Colonel's vital signs deteriorate with the precision of someone reading a language she'd spent 12 years learning. Stable at 8:30. Slight elevation in respiratory rate by 9 o'clock. Blood pressure creeping down at 10:15. That looked to his chest, shallow, labored. By midnight, his oxygen saturation had dipped to 92 despite the supplemental O2, and his heart rate had climbed to 118, the kind of numbers that meant something was wrong, something specific, something that didn't belong. Cardiac tamponade. She'd seen it twice before in her career, both times in field conditions in Anbar province, when blast trauma compressed the pericardial sac and turned a beating heart into a pump fighting against itself. The signs were there if you knew how to read them, the muffled heart sounds, the narrowed pulse pressure, the patient's skin taking on that peculiar greyish pallor. She'd considered mentioning it to the attending. Then she'd remembered the discipline notice and the way the other nurses' coffee cups had stopped appearing when she sat in the break room. The alarm wailed again, louder this time, and Laura was moving before her conscious mind caught up. Supply closet to hallway. Hallway to ICU wing. The code blue announcement had come through the overhead speakers, and she could already hear the sound of feet on tile, rapid and purposeful, the particular percussion of a hospital responding to cardiac emergency. She was 3 steps from the Colonel's room when Sterling materialized in the hallway like something that had always been there, just waiting for the right moment to become visible. Bennett. His voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. You're not on his care team. Step back. Laura tried to move around him. Through the window behind Sterling, she could see the Colonel's wife gripping the bed rail, could see the daughter, she was maybe 12, thin-shouldered and terrified, pressed against the far wall. Could see the monitors displaying numbers that were sliding into territory where the brain started to suffer from lack of oxygen. Sterling shifted his weight, and his arm came up, his hand closing around her elbow. I said step back. That's an order. The grip was firm but not violent, the kind of pressure that communicated intention without crossing into something that would show on video. Laura could have broken the contact in 0.3 seconds. She could have pivoted, used his own momentum against him, left him on the floor wondering what had happened. The knowledge of how to do it lived in her shoulders, in the muscle memory of 1,000 defensive drills, in the person she'd been when giving orders instead of taking them mattered. She didn't move. The attending physician arrived then, Dr. Valdez, a competent clinician with kind eyes and a reputation for erring toward patient care over bureaucracy. He took one look at the monitors through the window, one look at Laura and Sterling locked in their peculiar tableau, and his expression shifted. Sterling released Laura's arm. Dr. Valdez, I need to brief you on the nursing situation here. There are documented concerns about competency. Sterling pulled him aside. Laura watched his mouth move, watched him glance toward the disciplinary notice still pinned to the unit board, watched Valdez's face harden like concrete setting. 30 seconds. That's all it took. Valdez turned back to the room, looked at the monitors one more time, then walked away. Not toward the code. Away. Another attending arrived. Sterling made a phone call. Laura could hear him, his voice low and professional. Yes, sir, I understand the liability concerns. Her file has documented incompetence. I'd hate for us to be exposed if something goes wrong here. The second attending left too. More doctors came. They always did for a code. It was one of the unspoken codes of hospital culture: respond first and sort out the details after. But Sterling was a filter, a carefully placed obstruction, and he wielded his phone like a weapon. To the third doctor, he mentioned malpractice exposure. To the fourth, he referenced the disciplinary record. To the fifth, sixth, seventh, he just stood in the hallway with his tablet, his expression professionally concerned, and let the architecture of fear do the work. 8 doctors came and went. 9. The colonel's skin had gone the color of old paper. His wife was crying now, not the sharp crying of acute panic but the flat, gasping crying of someone watching the light go out of something living. The daughter had her hand over her mouth. The 10th attending physician was Dr. Chen, senior staff, someone who'd actually trained Laura on procedure protocol when she'd first started at Sacred Heart. He looked at the monitors, at Sterling, at Laura standing frozen in the hallway. He opened his mouth like he was going to move toward the room. Then Sterling's phone appeared in his hand again, and he was stepping away, saying something into it about liability. Chen's jaw tightened. He said nothing as he walked past. 10. The number crystallized in Laura's mind with the cold clarity of tactical assessment. 10 doctors, each one a choice. Each one Sterling's doing, yes, but also each one a person who decided their career was worth more than the patient bleeding out behind glass. She was alone in the hallway when the colonel's heart rate began its final descent. 118 to 102 to 89. The monitors showing the cascade, the body finally surrendering to the pressure crushing its vital organs. Laura's hand moved to her pocket where the key to her locker sat cold against her thigh, the key to the boots, to the past, to the person who didn't flinch when lives hung in the balance. She'd come back to Sacred Heart to survive. She'd accepted the reassignment and the restriction and the hostile stares because she was done fighting, done leading, done being the person who stood between the darkness and other people's children. But watching the colonel's daughter cry. Watching 10 different doctors choose their comfort over a man's life. Watching Sterling stand in the hallway like a sentry, tablet in hand, ensuring that no one would challenge him. Something shifted inside her, not a decision exactly, but a recognition. The recognition that some lines, once you'd crossed them, you couldn't uncross. That she'd spent for years trying to be small, and all it had done was make her smaller. That the boots in her locker weren't a symbol of the life she'd fled. They were a symbol of the life she'd chosen to remember. The room went dead silent. Just for a moment, that particular silence that happens when monitors flatten and breathing stops and the world takes a collective breath. Then Laura moved toward the code room, and Sterling's hand came out again, his voice saying, "Bennett, I'm not going to ask again." But by then, she'd already made her choice. She didn't speed up. She didn't acknowledge him. She moved with the kind of quiet deliberation that was its own answer, and the door to the colonel's room was opening before anyone thought to stop her. The code alarm screamed through the ICU wing at 2:07 a.m. 3 beeps, then silence, then 3 beeps again, the sound that meant someone's heart was drowning in its own fluid. Laura heard it from the hallway and moved before the overhead announcement finished crackling. Colonel Reeve. Room for 12. The monitor showed pressure dropping like a stone down a well, systolic falling from 98 to 76 to 64. His wife was already screaming something. His daughter stood frozen in the doorway, watching the man who'd carried her through a firefight 10 years ago now gasping for air like a landed fish. Laura was 3 doors away when she saw them. 10 doctors. 10 different ones, she counted them without thinking, the cardiologist who'd handled the admission, the 2 hospitalists on night shift, the surgical resident, the attending from the ICU, 2 fellows she didn't recognize, the ER director, an infectious disease consultant Sterling had called in yesterday, and 1 more in scrubs she'd never seen before. They stood in a cluster outside the room like pallbearers at a funeral they hadn't decided to attend yet. Sterling stood in the center of them, phone still in his hand, his voice carrying down the corridor with the precision of a man who'd spent years practicing this exact moment. "I've documented her incompetence. Medication error 3 days ago. Fabricated disciplinary record filed with the state board. Liability exposure is catastrophic if she touches that patient again. Any intervention she performs, you're personally liable. Malpractice insurance won't cover a nurse operating outside her scope. His jaw worked as he spoke, face flushed with the color of a man watching his investments collapse. The doctors exchanged glances. One by one, they moved away from the room. Not all at once. That would have looked suspicious. But systematically, each one finding a reason, a page, a patient check, a consultation in another wing. Within 30 seconds, the hallway outside room for 12 held only Sterling and the echo of their absence. Laura was 5 feet away when Sterling turned and saw her. His face transformed. Eyes wide. Mouth already open. "Bennett, you're not authorized," he screamed, stepping directly into the doorway, his body filling the space like he could block her with sheer fury. "Step back. I'm warning you. Step back right now." She didn't acknowledge him. She moved with the kind of quiet deliberation that was its own answer. Her shoulder brushed past his collarbone, a contact so precise it was almost gentle, and the door to the colonel's room was opening before he finished his sentence. His hands grabbed at her scrub sleeve. She didn't stop. She didn't even slow. The fabric slipped through his fingers like water. Inside the room, Colonel Marcus Reeve was the color of old concrete. Jugular veins distended on both sides of his neck like cords pulled tight. His wife stood pressed against the far wall, both hands over her mouth. The colonel's breathing was shallow, desperate, each inhale a small failure. The monitor showed pulsus paradoxus, systolic pressure dropping 12 points with each breath. Classic tamponade. Classic death coming in the next 4 minutes if nothing changed. Laura's voice dropped an octave. "I need you to step out. Right now." It wasn't a request. It wasn't even kind. It was the tone she'd used to clear a field hospital when incoming fire was 30 seconds away. The colonel's wife moved toward the door without argument, her legs understanding something her brain hadn't processed yet. Sterling was still screaming from the hallway. "She's not qualified. She's going to kill him. Security. I need security in here now." His voice cracked on the last word. Laura didn't turn around. She moved to the bedside, her hands already moving, already knowing what they needed to do. "I need a pericardiocentesis kit. Now," she said to the resident frozen near the monitor, a young man with terror in his eyes and a stethoscope around his neck like a talisman that wasn't working. He bolted. Laura prepped the site on the colonel's chest with an alcohol swab, her hand steady as surgical steel. The skin was cool. His breathing was getting shallower. 70 seconds, maybe 90, before his heart stopped completely. The kit appeared. She didn't look at who brought it. Didn't matter. Her hands found the landmarks by muscle memory older than her civilian identity. The xiphoid process. The left shoulder. The angle already calculated in her body's archive of procedures she performed in sandstorms and blackouts and situations where there was no backup, no attending physician, no choice except do it right or watch someone die. "She's not authorized. She's going to kill him." Sterling's voice was a shriek now, something breaking in it. His words meant nothing. They landed on Laura's consciousness like rain on steel. The needle entered below the xiphoid process at exactly 45 degrees, advancing slowly, feeling for the membrane that separated blood from air and life from death. Security arrived through the door with the subtlety of a truck. 2 officers, both reaching for Laura's arm. She ignored them. The needle advanced deeper. She felt the pericardial sac give way, that soft pop of resistant surrendering. The syringe began to fill with dark blood. 60 milliliters. The colonel's oxygen saturation climbed from 78% to 82%. His breathing became less desperate. She continued aspirating. 80 milliliters. His blood pressure started rising. 100 milliliters. The heart sounds cleared like someone had turned up the volume on a radio that had been underwater. Sterling's voice had stopped screaming. The silence was heavier than any sound, the kind of silence that filled rooms when certainty collapsed into something else entirely. Laura withdrew the needle with the same precision she'd inserted it, applied pressure to the site with her gloved hand, and watched the monitor stabilize into a steady rhythm. Sinus rhythm. Normal. Beautiful. The Colonel's eyes flickered open for just a moment, unfocused and confused, before sliding closed again. His wife was crying. His daughter had both hands pressed against the window of the room's glass partition, her face a mask of something between hope and understanding. Nurse Bennett just performed an unauthorized invasive procedure in direct violation of her scope of practice and my explicit orders. Sterling's voice came from behind her now, lower, more controlled, but trembling with barely contained rage. He was standing in the doorway again, breathing hard, his eyes fixed on her face like he was trying to burn a hole through her. She's terminated effective immediately. Escort her out. Now. Laura stripped off her gloves, deposited them in the biohazard container, and moved without rushing to her locker at the end of the corridor. The security officers followed her like shadows that had learned to walk upright. She spun the combination lock on the small metal cabinet, her hands moving through the ritual one last time. A change of clothes. A small photo she'd never shown anyone. And at the bottom, wrapped in a plastic bag so old the material had started to crack, the pair of worn combat boots she'd carried to work every day for 3 years and never worn once. She held them in both hands like they were more fragile than they actually were. Her fingers traced the faded Velcro on the ankle cuffs, the scuff marks from desert sand that no amount of washing had ever removed completely. The boots were her actual name. These boots were the parts of her that hadn't fit into the nursing scrubs and the deferential voice and the slow disappearance she'd constructed out of survival and shame. The security officers waited near the exit. Sterling's voice carried through the hospital from somewhere behind them, already on his phone, his words reaching her even as she walked toward the glass doors. Dangerous. Unstable. Potential criminal liability. She heard him tell someone at the state nursing board they should immediately suspend her license pending investigation. She heard him use words like medication diversion and psychiatric instability like he was seasoning his lies to make them taste more convincing. The Portland dawn was the color of dishwater. Rain had started while she was inside, not hard, just persistent, the kind of rain that suggested the sky had decided to cry and had settled in for the long haul. Laura walked out into it carrying only the boots and whatever remained of the woman who used to command field hospitals under mortar fire. The security guard stayed by the door. Nobody followed her further. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a few cars that belonged to people working shifts longer than she would ever work again. She stood at the edge of the pavement and looked back at Sacred Heart's lit windows. Somewhere inside, a colonel was breathing because her hands remembered how to save lives. Somewhere inside, Sterling was finishing his phone calls, believing he'd contained the situation, believing he'd silenced the one person who could have testified against him. Somewhere inside, 10 doctors who refused to enter a dying man's room were probably just beginning to understand that they'd been played by a man with a plan and a network of allies and no conscience. 3 days later, Laura was sitting in the waiting room of the VA hospital, the same one where she'd sat after being fired, holding the boots and contemplating whether disappearance was the same thing as death, when her phone rang. Sacred Heart's administrator. Voice careful, professional, apologetic in a way that suggested someone had already threatened a lawsuit. The colonel's son had discovered something in his father's medical records. Phantom procedures. Billing codes for surgeries that never happened. Tests that were never performed. The son was a lawyer. He'd already consulted with a forensic accountant. He was calling the state medical board unless Sacred Heart did one very specific thing. They wanted Laura back. Wanted her reinstated immediately. Wanted the disciplinary record expunged. Wanted her signature on a document acknowledging that her termination had been unjust. They wanted all of this more than they wanted their next paycheck. Laura had listened to the administrator explain all of this without speaking. When he finished, she'd said only, "I'll be there tomorrow," and hung up before he could promise her anything else or ask her anything more. She'd held the boots and thought about the colonel lying in that ICU bed, still not knowing her name, still sleeping off the medication that was keeping him quiet while his heart learned how to beat without drowning. She dressed in fresh scrubs and returned to Sacred Heart at 6 in the morning. The unit had transformed into something different than it had been. Whispers followed her down the corridor, but they weren't the whispers of 3 days ago. These carried different weight. These carried the sound of people who'd suddenly understood that they'd been wrong about something fundamental, that their judgment had been corrupted by a man with an institutional voice and a plan they hadn't questioned thoroughly enough. Sterling wasn't there that morning. He was at home, probably, making calls to lawyers. The colonel was awake but groggy, still disconnected from the strange clarity of his surroundings. His daughter watched Laura check his vitals with an intensity that felt almost predatory. At 1:33 p.m., the ER page came through, gunshot victim, critical but stable, Iraqi national, refugee resettlement case. Laura was assigned post-op monitoring. She followed the gurney to the post-op unit, initiated the FORS, and sat beside the man as he surfaced from anesthesia in that strange, confused way that meant the medications were wearing off but consciousness hadn't quite solidified yet. The man's eyes opened. Found her face. And then something changed in them, fear and recognition and something that looked like gratitude mixed into a single, terrible expression. "You," he said in English fractured by an accent that carried the weight of 2 continents and a decade of displacement. "You are the senior chief from Tikrit. The one who saved the American colonel." His voice carried through the post-op unit like he was announcing the resurrection of the dead. By dawn, Dr. Sterling had already written the termination letter. His signature was flourished, elegant, the kind of penmanship that belonged in a courtroom rather than a personnel file. Laura was escorted from Sacred Heart by 2 hospital security officers who wouldn't meet her eyes, her badge deactivated before she even reached the parking lot. Sterling had moved fast. Within hours, he'd contacted every reference she'd listed in her original hire packet. Drug diversion. Medication errors. Unprofessional conduct during critical procedures. The allegation spread like contamination through the Portland medical network. 3 hospitals red-flagged her applications before she could even submit them. One emergency department called back within minutes of reading Sterling's carefully worded email, "I cannot in good conscience recommend this individual for patient-facing roles." It wasn't a request to withdraw her application. It was a door slamming shut. Laura walked out of Sacred Heart carrying only those worn combat boots, their leather cracked from Tikrit heat, their laces frayed from 5 years in a hospital locker. She sat in her car for 20 minutes without starting the engine, staring at the boots as if they might explain how invisible she'd made herself, and how quickly that invisibility could become erasure. 3 days later, a man with a gunshot wound to the left shoulder arrived by ambulance. His accent was thick, his English fractured, but his eyes went wide the moment Laura entered the trauma bay. She was back, no ceremony, no announcement, just suddenly reinstated after the colonel's son had discovered something while reviewing his father's billing statements. Phantom procedures. Surgeries marked as completed that never happened. A cardiac catheterization billed at $47,000 for a patient who'd been unconscious the entire time. The son, a forensic accountant, had pulled the thread and watched the entire scheme unravel. He'd contacted administration. He'd contacted the state medical board. He'd contacted someone at the FBI field office. The man on the stretcher watched Laura move through the trauma bay with the fluid precision of someone who'd seen worse than a shoulder wound. Much worse. His voice came out in halting English, rough with pain but certain with recognition. You are the senior chief. From Tikrit. The one who saved the American colonel. The trauma team froze. Laura's hands kept moving, checking the dressing, noting the entry wound's location, assessing for exit trauma. Her face remained neutral, but her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. One of the residents started to ask a question. Laura cut them off with a single look, and the room obeyed. She'd earned something those 5 years ago that no hospital could take from her, and it was beginning to crystallize in the air around her like an electric charge. What happened next didn't just silence the room, it ended a career. The FBI agent arrived that afternoon with credentials that made the hospital administrator go pale. Special Agent Morrison, Federal Fraud Task Force, and she had been investigating Dr. Sterling for 7 months. 7 months of phone records. 7 months of billing audits. 7 months of building a case so airtight that when the arrest warrant was signed, it came with 15 counts of wire fraud, 12 counts of insurance fraud, and 3 federal counts of falsifying medical records. But it was the forgery allegation that made Sterling's face drain completely of color when they read it aloud in the center of the ICU. He'd gone back into the digital personnel system after Laura's termination. He'd added timestamps to her disciplinary write-up. He'd altered the original report to make it seem like it had been filed days before the colonel's cardiac arrest, creating a false paper trail to justify why she should never have been allowed near a critical patient. That alteration, Morrison explained, was conspiracy to obstruct justice. Federal offense. Sterling's voice cracked as they walked him toward the exit. This is insane. I'm a physician. I have board connections. My attorney, Morrison, didn't raise her voice. She rarely needed to. Your board connections are currently being interviewed in separate rooms. 3 have already confirmed you called them personally, pressuring them to support your request for Bennett's termination. We have recordings of every call. Your attorney can review them at the federal courthouse. They moved through the hallway like water flowing around a stone. Sterling's expensive silk tie, Hermes, probably $800, suddenly looked obscene under the fluorescent lights, garish and desperate. An agent removed the fabricated disciplinary write-up from the unit board where it had hung for 3 days. Bagged it. Tagged it. Evidence. The nurses who'd abandoned Laura in the break room watched in silence as Sterling passed. One covered her mouth. Another's eyes filled with tears. A third simply turned away, unable to face what she'd let happen. The perp walk continued into the ER. 10 doctors. That specific number. Sterling had called every attending on the evening shift, invoking the fabricated disciplinary record, citing liability concerns, warning them that if they entered the colonel's room, they'd be associated with negligence. 10 doctors had listened. 10 doctors had hesitated. 9 of them weren't here to see this, but one was. Dr. Castellano, the ER attending who'd asked Sterling directly about the disciplinary write-up before refusing to help. He was present now, watching Sterling pass in handcuffs. He tried to approach Laura afterward, his face tight with shame. I should have gone in. I should have questioned it more. Laura turned away. Not ready. Not yet. The Iraqi patient, his shoulder heavily bandaged but consciousness sharp, watched Sterling pass through the corridor. His eyes met Laura's across the distance. He nodded, that slow, deliberate gesture of recognition that exists between warriors who've learned respect through fire. The FBI detailed the charges as they moved toward the exit. Wire fraud for billing Medicare for phantom procedures. Insurance fraud for submitting claims for surgeries that never occurred. Falsifying federal medical records. Witness tampering through coordinated calls to board members. Conspiracy to obstruct justice through the personnel record forgery. Sterling's voice rose to a shout, the composed, arrogant doctor finally fracturing. She performed an unauthorized procedure. She violated protocol. She should be the one in handcuffs. Morrison's response was flat, unmoved, delivered like she was reading a grocery list. She saved a man's life while you were billing Medicare for phantom surgeries. Colonel Marcus Reeve's cardiac tamponade would have killed him within minutes. You billed his insurance for a cardiac catheterization that never happened. The math isn't complicated, doctor. The exit doors opened. News cameras flashed, someone had tipped the media, and Sterling's carefully constructed reputation dissolved in seconds. His face would be on every local channel by evening, photographed in handcuffs, the golden boy physician unraveling on live television. The hospital administrator appeared before the cameras could swarm further, announced Sterling's immediate termination, and stated that Sacred Heart was fully cooperating with the federal investigation. Her voice was steady, professional, and utterly devoid of mercy. In the aftermath, Laura stood alone in the supply room. The one where she'd hidden on terrible days, where she'd held those combat boots and wondered if anyone would ever know what they meant. Her hands were shaking now, real, physical tremors that only emerged when adrenaline faded and the weight of exposure came crashing down. She'd spent 5 years constructing an invisible life. 5 years becoming someone forgettable. A nurse. Just a nurse. And now everyone knew. Everyone would know. The SEAL team leader found her there, standing motionless between shelves of 4 bags and sterile gauze. His dress uniform was immaculate, and his eyes held the particular regard of someone who recognized the weight of a uniform you didn't think you'd wear again. "Senior Chief, the Navy wants to," she cut him off, her voice steady again now that she understood what was happening. "I'm not Senior Chief anymore. I left that behind." He studied her face, and something in his expression shifted. Not pity. Understanding. "You carried a dying colonel through enemy fire 3 days ago. You did it in a hospital hallway instead of Fallujah, but you did it. You didn't leave anything behind. You just changed the uniform." Laura didn't respond, but her hand stopped shaking. 1 week later, Colonel Reeve was strong enough to sit up. His mind was clearing, memories returning in fragments and whole sections like a hard drive slowly coming back online. He was touching the letters on his forearm, the tattoo he'd carried for 8 years, the name that meant the one who carried me when I couldn't carry myself. Laura entered for her shift and found him staring at those letters, his fingers tracing each one with the tenderness of prayer. When his eyes lifted to her face, recognition didn't crash through him. It exploded. Tears came instantly, streaming down his weathered face with the kind of force that couldn't be stopped or hidden. "Bennett," he whispered. "My God. It was you. In Tikrit. And here. You saved me twice." His voice broke completely. His daughter rushed in, and the 3 of them stood together in the stark hospital room, crying without shame or pretense. His wife arrived with a gift, Laura's actual personnel file from her Navy service, complete with commendation signed by admirals, not Sterling's fabricated version of disciplinary failures. "You should have these," she said quietly, placing the folder in Laura's hands. "You earned them." That afternoon, the hospital held a staff meeting in the main conference room. Chairs scraped. Coffee cups clinked. The administrator stood at the podium, and her first words were an apology. Public. Direct. Unambiguous. "We failed one of our own," she said. "We allowed fear to override our judgment. We allowed institutional pressure to prevent us from defending someone who stood up when it mattered most. That ends today. New protocols. Ethics training. Protections for whistleblowers." Several nurses who'd abandoned Laura in the break room approached her afterward. Ashamed. Asking forgiveness. Laura listened to each with that same quiet dignity she'd maintained for 5 years. Quiet dignity and nothing more. Simple nods. No absolution offered. No condemnation either. Just acknowledgement that they'd chosen poorly, and now they were choosing differently. The Iraqi patient was discharged the following week. Before he left, he approached Laura in the ICU hallway, and he extended his hand. His English was better now, the pain medication cleared from his system, his mind sharp. "In my country, we were enemies. You and me. Different sides. But I know honor when I see it. You saved my life. You saved your colonel. You did this while standing alone." They shook. 2 combat veterans from opposite sides of the same war, separated by language and history, connected by something neither side ever fully named but both completely understood. Laura walked to her locker one final time and retrieved those worn combat boots. She'd kept them hidden long enough. The hospital's military memorial case stood in the main lobby, glass and darkwood, displaying photographs of Sacred Heart staff who'd served. She carried the boots there. A small ceremony. Not required, not announced. Just present. The SEAL team leader came. Colonel Reeve in a wheelchair, strong enough now to leave the ICU. His family. A few colleagues. Laura placed the boots inside the case, side by side with a plaque engraved while she was still in the hospital. Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett, United States Navy, Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor, Bronze Star with Valor. These boots walked through fire so others could live. She closed the case and locked it. No longer hiding. No longer running. 6 months later, Dr. Sterling sat at a folding table outside a strip mall in northeast Portland, a banner reading discount insurance flapping in the Pacific wind. He tried to hand flyers to disinterested passers-by who wouldn't make eye contact. His voice was smaller now. His suit was off the rack. A news story about his sentencing, 3 years federal prison, restitution to Medicare of $847,000, permanent medical license revocation, played on someone's phone as they walked past without taking his flyer. Back at Sacred Heart, Laura trained a new graduate nurse in the ICU, her voice steady and precise as she explained the monitor readings, the medication drips, the signs of deterioration to watch for. Colonel Reeve visited regularly for follow-ups, walking without assistance now, always stopping to talk. His daughter volunteered at the hospital 3 afternoons a week. She wanted to be a military nurse like Laura. In the break room, Laura sat with her coffee, and colleagues joined her table without hesitation. Conversation flowing easily. She still had PTSD. Still had nightmares sometimes. Still woke some mornings thinking about Tikrit, about the weight of a dying man, about the sound of gunfire and the choice to stay when everyone else was running. But she'd learned something Sterling never understood. True class is what you do when the lights go out. If you found yourself rooting for Laura, if you felt the weight of standing alone against a system designed to protect itself, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? And share this story with someone who needs to hear that heroes don't always wear capes, sometimes they wear scrubs and carry boots that remember everything.